One of the things I've always dreamed of being able to do is imagining any pose from any angle and just drawing it. In theory, it seems so easy. I can see the pose so clearly in my head. But somehow, when I try to transfer this pose onto paper, it just never works for some reason. Why? But after years of trying, I think I finally cracked the code. I found the ultimate exercise that will finally allow me to draw any pose I can imagine. But it's gonna be really hard. I can't just jump into it right away. There are prerequisites. There are 4 levels of pose drawing that I need to master before I can tackle this challenge. So let's start at level 1. At this point, I had only just learned that art fundamentals even existed, and the only art practice I knew about at the time was timed gesture drawing. And since it's all I knew, it's what I did. At the time, I figured that if I just kept doing lots and lots of gesture drawing, then I would eventually be able to draw a pose as well. It kind of makes sense, after all. Gesture drawing is just drawing a bunch of poses, right? But somehow, no matter how much gesture drawing I did, I wasn't really able to transfer any of these poses I drew into my personal work. Why was that? For starters, gesture drawing isn't really about getting better at drawing poses, although of course it does help. It's more about developing an understanding about the energy and flow of a pose. So that's the reason why you often have a time limit when doing gesture drawing, so that you focus more on that rather than the detailed anatomy. It's not really about learning the construction of the human body or the pose, which meant that I needed to move on to level 2. At this point, I had developed a better understanding of proportion, i.e. how long or large things are compared to each other. Obviously, this helps a ton when drawing the human figure. I had also started studying anatomy in more detail. Doing these anatomy studies made me realize, maybe I should be approaching pose studies in the same way. I was very carefully and deliberately copying out muscle diagrams and writing notes. Why don't I do the same thing for poses? So I started doing pose studies. I found some interesting poses on the internet and copied them carefully. And to make absolutely sure that these poses were stored in my visual library, I did a pretty interesting exercise. Instead of simply copying a pose, I would start by observing it. Then I would put the reference away and try to draw it from memory. When I was done, I would take the image back out and copy it, making a note of where I made mistakes or incorrect assumptions. This worked surprisingly well. After I studied a particular pose, I found that I was able to reproduce it when I wanted to. But there was still one very major problem. I could only draw these poses in the angle that I studied them in. I couldn't draw them from any other angle. That's not really that useful. There had to be something I was doing wrong. So first, let me explain how I was thinking about these pose studies I was doing. I would examine the shapes that the body parts would make on the page, how long or short the limbs looked, and I'd also pay attention to the angles of the limbs relative to each other. That makes sense, right? Except, I was missing one very crucial fact, which was that I was thinking of the body as a 2D shape on a page, rather than 3D forms in space. And in order to fix this, yep, it's time for boxes. I've talked about how great boxes are on this channel plenty of times, so if you want more information, you can check out these videos. I've left links in the descriptions. But in short, drawing boxes is one way of training your 3D thinking and intuition. It helped me so much, and in order to make use of my newfound knowledge, I also developed this sort of boxy 3D mannequin. And this mannequin was designed to solve a very specific problem. Let's say I was drawing a figure from a top-down perspective. If the head is here, how far down is the shoulder supposed to be? Here? Here? If I had a mannequin made of boxes and cylinders that I knew the size of, and I could draw them accurately in perspective, it meant that I could start measuring in 3D space and answer this question. One of the most helpful exercises I did was to draw a simplified human figure rotated in every angle, like this. But why? I want to draw every pose, right? Not just a standing one. Something to realize, though, is that you can use that neutral pose as a point of reference when drawing other poses. It's pretty helpful. Also, around this time, I started using posemaniacs.com as a reference more often, instead of drawing only from real human photos. Of course, a 3D model is never going to be as accurate as real life because it can't replicate skin, fat, and muscle deformations. But what it is good at is clarity in 3D space, especially since you can rotate them around like this. So I kept practicing, and I was getting pretty good at sketching these boxy mannequins. So really, all I had to do was to use the boxy mannequin as a sketch, and then I could draw a body on top of it, and then... Huh? Wait, why does it look so off? I thought I had it all figured out. I could theoretically draw these boxy mannequins in any pose, in any angle. Why does it look so bad when I try to turn it into an actual drawing? I was stumped, to the point where I even asked on Twitter, so thank goodness for people who are willing to help me out. So one of the main reasons was that this mannequin simply was not detailed enough. By simplifying so many details away, it was really hard for me to spot any errors in construction. And I was also not thinking about parts of the anatomy that could affect the silhouette and shape of the body. For instance, here I just use a simple box to represent the pelvis. However, I was failing to consider how the butt muscles would affect how the body would look in different leg poses. By slavishly following the box mannequin as a guide, I was amplifying the mistakes I wasn't able to see. I had to fix this, but how? Well, if I was missing out on all the subtle bumps, curves, and details of the human body, why don't I try to develop a more detailed mannequin? It's still simplified, of course, but hopefully a lot closer to reality. But in any case, it's finally time for the ultimate pose practice. Once again, here's a 3D model from posemaniacs.com. It's a relatively simple standing pose, though maybe the arms look a little complicated. I first copied that pose to try to understand it. So far, so good. But here comes the hard part. Now, I'm going to try to imagine it from a different angle and try to draw it without reference. Well, since it's my first attempt, I don't think I'll try anything too crazy, so first let's just try drawing it from above. Actually, I have quite a lot of practice drawing from this angle, so I don't think it goes too badly. I can mostly just rely on my muscle memory. When I'm done, I go back to the 3D model, then rotate it to check, and oh, that doesn't look too far off, actually. Maybe this exercise isn't going to be as challenging as I thought, or maybe I'm actually a genius. But of course, it's not as if there aren't mistakes. I definitely need to pay more attention to the angle of the head and how the shoulders are actually more raised. But in theory, if I just keep taking note of mistakes and try not to make them again, I'll eventually run out of mistakes to make, right? At least that's the idea. So what if I try again from an angle I almost never draw? A worm's eye view, and from behind. And as soon as I start drawing, I immediately feel completely out of my depth. I have no idea where to put the arms and legs. Can you even see the arm from this angle? I'm sure it's wrong, but I'll draw it like this. Well, I'm sure it's not right, but then I'll rotate the model to check and oh, hey, that's way closer than I thought it'd be. I'm still not really accounting for the curve of the spine here, and I'm still getting the direction of the head wrong. But I'll just make another note and move on. Well, maybe it doesn't seem too difficult yet because it's still a pretty simple standing pose. I have a lot of practice with that because my favorite genre of drawing is person stands in white void. I'm a lot less familiar with squatting poses, so let's try this one. I'll start with a simple side view to check that I really understand what I'm looking at. And then once again, I'll check with the reference and, well, at least I got the general idea, right? But the reference looks way more intense and dynamic. I think the lowered head, raised shoulders, and straighter arms make the pose look more tense. I've also forgotten about the curve of the spine again, and I've made a pretty big mistake with the legs. I've pointed them both forward, when in fact they go outward at an angle. I'll have to remember that. This was already a lot harder than the standing pose, so why don't I make it even harder by drawing it from below? And oh boy, I feel like I'm just making stuff up. I have no idea what I'm doing. Where do the arms go? The head? I checked the pose and, as expected, I got most of it completely wrong. In particular, I somehow forgot that the chest has width to it. The legs did look closer than I expected, but I still have to remember that they look bigger the closer they get to the camera. There is still so much for me to work on, but I think we should test this exercise, just to see if it even helped at all. I'm gonna try to redraw some drawings that I really struggled with 6 months ago. For example, take a look at this segue pose. It's fine, I guess, but there are definitely lots of problems with it. One issue is that the pose is very static and boring, although since the character is on a segue, there really isn't a whole lot I can do about that. So I have to think of another way to make it more dynamic. I'll try changing the perspective instead. So I go for a kind of cool, bendy fisheye perspective, which is something I've never actually done before in my entire life. Well, there's a first time for everything, right? And because it's my first time, as expected, it doesn't really seem to be coming out that great. Usually, I would have already given up at this point, but I'm gonna try something new. I'll try simply trusting my intuition and adjusting the drawing based on vibes alone. I have no idea if this is gonna work. Is it actually okay to trust myself? So I clean it up, add some values, and this is how it turned out. I mean, it's not perfect, but surprisingly, I don't think this is too bad at all. But wait, before celebrating, remember how I said I have a lot of practice with neutral standing poses, which is more or less what this is. I won't know for sure whether my practice worked unless I try something a bit more challenging. So let's try again with another drawing that I'm not happy with. But this time, it's more of a squatting pose. Again, an issue with this drawing is that it looks too boring and static. Even though he's crouched and holding a weapon, it looks like he's just posing for a camera. How can I make this more energetic? I'm emboldened by the fact that my first attempt at a fisheye perspective turned out sorta okay, so I'll try again. And fortunately, unlike the previous drawing, I can probably afford to take more liberties with the pose. Remember the mistakes I made with this shooting pose? About the things that made the pose look more intense, such as a lowered head and hunched shoulders. I'll try to apply these lessons to the pose I'm drawing now. I'm also going to pay attention to the flow of the hair and the clothing so that they work with the motion and energy of the body rather than against it. Here's how the sketch looks. I think that's a pretty promising start, but there is still one more problem to consider. Thinking back to my previous attempt, I do think it was reasonably successful and it looks better than the old drawing. But I did end up using a sketchier style and adding some hatching. I could just be masking my errors without realizing it. So in order to have a fairer comparison, this time I'm going to try finishing it in the same style as the old drawing. This means relatively clean liner of constant line width and solid black fills. However, because of those solid black fills, I start having problems with how the glove and the legs are interacting. They're almost merging together into one shape. Normally, I would be too afraid to deviate from the sketch too much at this point, but once again, I decided to try trusting my intuition. So after adding these values, here's the final results. Honestly, if you compare these drawings to the original, I think there's a lot of improvement. I'm quite pleased with myself. Obviously, they're far from perfect though. For example, I think I might have made the hands a bit too large in both drawings when I was trying to push the perspective. They look a little distorted, but that's okay. I've always been very timid when it comes to posing and perspective, and perhaps now I've gone a little too far in the opposite direction. But if I'm going to make a mistake, I'd much rather go too far rather than not far enough. If I keep practicing, one day I'll find a happy medium that I'm satisfied with. What do you think? Do you think I managed to improve at drawing poses? Drop a subscribe button and a dynamic pose if you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye!